Hi, welcome to Vibration Cinema. Happy Pride, etc. and so forth. This video is going to serve as an intro to our third channel series, Gays in Film, which will focus on the cinematic history, aesthetics, and misadventures of the LGBTers on screen. In this episode, though, I want to tackle how visibility politics ironically coerces us to hide aspects of ourselves, to go back in the closet, so to speak. We brushed up against this idea in the Punks video, looking at how the strict machinations of preservations are under capitalism. This video is unfortunately very US-centric and MLM-focused. That's my experience, so I'm comfortable speaking on it. I do have pitches for videos in this series outside of such a narrow framework, but I do want to do right by them, so I want to make sure that the research is really tight. And as VC grows, I'm thinking about incorporating interviews and guest contributors to cover topics that I think are worthwhile but are beyond my capacity. With that said, in his essay, Gays in Film, Richard Dyer says that oppression does not just produce a subculture sensibility. It merely provides the contradictions in relation to which oppressed group create their own subculture and attendant sensibilities. Queerness is both invisible and hypervisible. This is essentially the function of the closet, right? It's a tool we use to camouflage ourselves out of defense of the consequences of being seen as a lil sus. Even in secret spaces we created for ourselves, they're always surveyed. We understand the history of the Vice Police raiding bars like the Black Cat and Stonewall, etc.
That was fighting for gay rights, and people were killed.
Nobody was killed at Stonewall.
Nobody was killed?
Nobody was killed at Stonewall.
And I think it's important to recognize, especially what's going on now with the recent bills coming out of Florida and Ohio about getting trans youth out of sports. Ostensibly, these bills are there to discourage trans athletes from competing, to render them invisible. But what the state has done is essentially deputized citizens who think they recognize incongruities between children and their gender to disappear them. In practice, of course, these legislations facilitate the legalized sexual abuse of minors, and officiating gender is a white supremacist endeavor that reads Black women as inherently deviant. And we see this with someone like Castor Cinema. Hypervisibility and invisibility necessitate each other in this sense, and I don't want to lose sight of that. When the entirety of the state is weaponized against you and encourages its citizens to follow suit, one of the only reprieves from such violence is community. In order to survive, we piloted free healthcare to a limited extent before it was on the mainstream legislative agenda. And we created infrastructures that probably won't even make that agenda, like free housing through the Star House and ball culture.
When someone has rejection from their mother and father or their family, when they get out in the world, they search. They search for someone to fill that void. I know this for experience because I've had kids come to me and latch hold to me like I'm their mother or like I'm their father, because they can talk to me and I'm gay and they're gay, and that's where a lot of that baldness and the mother business comes in. Because they're real parents and give them such a hard way to go, they look up to me to fill that void.
There are, of course, liberal elements throughout our history, but we were pretty much barred from openly participating in normative politics, so we had to come up with our own system. And the shape of our culture, including cinema, followed suit. Censors banned any explicit reference to homosexuality or gender nonconformance, and if it was alluded to, it always seemed to be grotesque. Such bans were written expressly in the production code, for example, and later, depictions of homosexuality were ipso facto always already pornographic and therefore subjected to interference. We were forced into the underground, and baby, we took it over and became the avant-garde. We created music videos and the needle drop. We were doing Inception before Inception was Paprika. Our pornographers helped shape the home video and streaming markets, and we named montage the unique element of film. We pioneered public access TV. We did a lot of shit, right? As Vivacious puts it,
to me, the word gay means generations ahead of yesterday. And the straights are the yesterday. We've always been ahead. Everything we've done, they jump on board and take it over and pretend that they owned it. I'm like, bitch, we did that 5 years ago, and now you want to pretend you're the new metrosexual.
The idea of a bunch of the gays moving towards the middle stream, becoming these bourgeoisie homos.
I think we lose our identity
I think so
as gays.
too. Slouching towards respectability. There is no reason on earth why we should be striving for mediocrity.
I liked it when the gays had our own culture, when we shopped in our own stores, where we built each one up.
I liked feeling like
Yes.
I was doing something subversive and
Yes,
something different.
pushing the bar to the point where by the time they catch up to us, they're like, oh my God, this has been going on for that long. It's like, yes.
though cautious of the watchful eye of the state, we were essentially left to our own devices. But something shifted, arguably in the mid-90s, but certainly after the 2003 Lawrence versus Texas decision, which struck down anti-sodomy laws nationally. And the shape of gay politics shifted to electoralism and lobbyist groups like the ineptly named Human Rights Campaign. After Lawrence v. Texas, gay marriage was sold to the mainstream with a likeness mentality. We want 2.5 kids and a white picket fence just like you. The recently leaked draft of Justice Alito's decision on Roe v. Wade mentions both Lawrence and Obergefell, which mandated states recognize same-sex marriages, as targets that the Supreme Court might wish to reconsider. Now, in the era of representation, everything is flattened into the middle-class kind of conformity, literally the mentality of we want 2.5 kids and white picket fence just like you as movies. It's important to recognize that the structure of Hollywood has a lot to do with this as well. In the 90s independent boom, some of the new queer cinema films were distributed by the likes of Miramax and New Line Cinema, and though not all of them reflected the anger and nihilism of the time, most of them were still very playful. They weren't played straight, as it were. Now, the most easily accessible LGBT films are neutered. There's no anger and no playfulness to it. And I think this neutering has a lot to do with like how safe Hollywood plays things right now. It's all remakes and rehashes and stuff like that. So there is no room to try new things. Dyer calls this incidental homosexuality, where gayness is a personality quirk. Could have easily been anything else. What this boils down to, he says, in terms of films, is that if you are representing sexual and emotional relationships on screen, it does make a difference whether they are gay or straight. One will not do as a metaphor for the other. Neither will either do as a general metaphor for human sexuality and relationships. When we say local equals global or specificity leads to universality, in this context, we've lost our locality, we've lost our specificity. We're supplanting our sex with heterosexuality in an attempt to make ourselves palatable. A lot is lost in that process. The spirit of inventiveness that's been a part of our film practice still exists, of course. I'm thinking particularly of Layla Weinraub, who put her 2018 documentary Shakedown about black lesbian strip clubs on Pornhub. This was a film that was getting praise from the Berlinale, at Tate, at MoMA, and at the Whitney, all of these super exclusive places, and it's great to play those venues, of course, but she never lost sight of who the film was celebrating and made it accessible to them in one of the most innovative distribution models of the modern era. And in fairness, the coming-of-age industrial complex is well within the tradition of gay film as social utility. Many kids use movies like Love, Simon to help them come out to their parents, and there's value in that. I'm not operating on a zero-sum game here. We praised Patrick Ian Polk for being innovative and unequivocally gay while following mainstream molds, and his work always has that social utility. His film teaches us about gay Harlem Renaissance, how to ready your buginus for a good time, about PrEP and PEP. Even pornographers like Chuck Holmes and Shishi LaRue mandated condoms be used on set to encourage safe sex practices at the onset of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Brendan McLean's music video for House of Air is like a cheat sheet for the codes of cruising, an art lost by the invention of Grindr. This is a volatile time for us in this country, and as things become more dire and electoralism continues to fail us, I think we're going to be compelled by survival instincts to refocus our politics to direct and immediate action. And I think, just how the new queer cinema movement and the AIDS video activists did in the 80s and 90s, our cinema will have to meet the moment. To switch gears a bit, I want to talk about another loss that I see in queer cinema, that of the erotic. And this, I think, has a bit to do with gay cinema going mainstream, but I also think, especially in America, it's more deeply rooted than that. In the Devil Finds Work, James Baldwin details what I mean in his reading of black and white homosocial movies like The Defiant Ones and Home of the Brave. Why is the price of what should, after all, be a simple human connection so high? Is it really necessary to lose a woman, an arm, or one's mind in order to say hello? And let's face it, kids, men suffer from penis envy on quite another level than women do. A crucial matter if yours is white and mine is black. Furthermore, no matter what St. Paul may thunder, love is where you find it. A man can fall in love with another man. Incarceration, torture, fire, death, and still more, the threat of these, have not been able to prevent it, nor will it ever. It became a grave and tragic matter on the North American continent, where white power became indistinguishable from the question of sexual dominance. But the question of sexual dominance can only exist in the nightmare of the soul, which has armed itself totally against the possibility of the changing motion of conquest and surrender, which is love. The choices do not involve, for example, that seismographic shudder, which the word homosexual until today produces in the American mind or soul. I doubt that Americans will ever be able to face the fact that that word, homosexual, is not a noun. The root of this word, as Americans use it, or as this word uses Americans, simply involves a terror of any human touch, since any human touch can change you. A black man and a white man can come together only in the absence of women, which is simply the American legend of masculinity brought to its highest pleasure and revealed, as it were, in black and white. Concurrent with this phenomenon today, as a grotesque outgrowth of the War on Terror, is a dissociation from ourselves and our bodies. R.S. Benedict wrote an article that is constantly on my mind, Everyone is Beautiful but Nobody is Horny, where she details how the ideal body in a culture obsessed with war and violence needs to be muscular, big, and threatening. And the use of such body necessitates that it's made for war and not sensuality. The rise of Instagram culture too has produced bodies that look like Grecian statues, and though I'm very well aware of Rule 34, it's very difficult to fuck a Grecian statue. If our bodies aren't cultivated for war, then they're created for visual pleasure. They certainly aren't created for physical pleasure. At this point, there's barely anything there to receive that seismographic shudder of another's touch that Baldwin writes about. This is a broader cultural problem that America faces. It isn't unique to the homos, but how we respond to this cultural political milieu is specific to our existence. Historically, our cinema has always been erotic. In the 1910s and 20s, we were part of the early erotic, with a K, films of Europe, and in the 70s, with the help of the Kostras, our films were alive through the porno circuit. Pornography is of course meant to titillate, but even outside of that genre, the short films of like Cheryl Dunye and Isaac Julian play with the erotic. There is a difference, of course, between a film that includes sex and one that is erotic, and Cheryl has spoken about this before. I think the new film Fire Island is a really good example of the former, and if sex is involved in any way in our cinema today, and again, I'm generalizing to the most easily accessible films, it plays out like this. As for the latter, I'm reminded of the existentialist film, Un Chant d'Amour. Clever use of a tiny hole in the wall that separates their cells, two men can escape the solitude of prison through the erotic, performing peep shows that mimic how one might want to be felt, shotgunning smoke. The yearning of another man's touch and the knowledge that he wants to reciprocate such touch is powerful enough to grant a kind of freedom that even the spyful guard becomes envious of. In East Palace, West Palace, Elan glamours a police officer coyly playing the submissive, leaning into the cop's power fantasy to seduce his way out of release. Of course, Elan wanted to be caught in the first place, so in that game of cat and mouse, perhaps it was Elan who ended up releasing the cop of his own hang-ups about his sexuality. Eroticism has that power that Jimmy talks about, that seismographic shift. I know a handful of gays for whom such a touch allowed them to discover themselves. The erotic is generative in that way. But our eroticism has always been dangerous too. The threat of being caught or blackmailed or beaten by the stakes are really high for pleasure. And that kind of eroticism, the dangerous kind, is so missed. Luckily, my friend Yami recently made a horror film on Dolby Coin called Hunted that's steeped in the dangers of the erotic, of violence and pleasure. But there's also the eroticism of care as a way to mend a relationship. It might hurt a little bit, but that's just growing pains. It's linked below, so go watch it. Our use of the erotic is waning, and it's really painful to see. As the country continues to rush headlong into a theocratic state, anything remotely resembling sex, including the erotic, is subject to backlash. And this plays out in online film criticism with that obnoxious mandate that sex scenes need to push the story forward. And a lot of the stories that these people complain about, the character is looking for a human connection, something to remind them of that joie de vivre. People need the transformative power of touch, Mary. Regardless of sexuality, we've been so conditioned to think of sex as purely extractive, that our bodies cannot be receptors of pleasure. It's crazy, but not me though, y'all be easy. Unfortunately, we ran out of time on this episode because I got some himbos lined up to... Never mind, TMI. But I know that this is a very limited video in scope. The political and aesthetic history is more complicated and contradictory than what I presented here. I really streamlined it. But this is a primer video, which is the beauty of having a series because I can expand on things. And this is the general makeup of Vibration Cinema anyway. All of the episodes refer to each other. Things become clearer as more episodes accumulate. But for this particular series, I know I want to do a video on AIDS video activism, a Cheryl Dunye retrospective, probably something on camp, Appy Shetpong's gay films. I'm 50-50 on new queer cinema. It's kind of overdone, but we'll see. Next time though, we're tackling the holy trinity of Black queer filmmakers and their use of the archive. Hope to see you then. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Have a happy and safe Pride, everyone. Goodbye.